Senate halts, Kennedy Center takeover as court hits Trump organization with $75 million penalty. Tonight brings news of a quiet but genuine victory, one that unfolded late in the legislative day and was largely overshadowed by louder headlines about Venezuela and escalating impeachment tensions. Still, it deserves attention. What happened on the Senate floor today represents the first visible crack in a year-long expansion of executive overreach that has cast a shadow over American democracy. This afternoon, the United States Senate, joined by 12 Republican lawmakers, moved decisively to block the president's attempt to seize executive control of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. Even more striking, a federal court in Washington, D.C. imposed what legal experts are calling unusually severe financial penalties on the Trump Organization and the president's personal estate for the misuse of federal funds connected to that effort. The fines reportedly approach $75 million. At first glance, this might appear to be a routine dispute over a public building, another headline about arts funding or a failed renaming attempt. But this was never about architecture or marquees. It was about national identity, institutional integrity, and the opaque financial maneuvers sustaining this administration. To understand why this moment matters, we have to look beyond the surface. Why the president became fixated on controlling a cultural institution, why the courts responded with extraordinary sanctions, and why the Senate, often reluctant to challenge him, finally decided this was a line that could not be crossed. How it began. The timeline is critical. Roughly 3 months ago, shortly after the Department of Government Efficiency began dismantling the National Endowment for the Arts, President Trump signed an executive directive that initially attracted little attention. Publicly, it was framed as a routine infrastructure initiative, but buried in its language was a claim that the Kennedy Center was deteriorating and mismanaged, an assertion widely disputed, yet used to justify rapid executive intervention. What followed was not a renovation plan, but an attempted transformation. The proposal called for dissolving the congressionally mandated bipartisan board of trustees and replacing it with a new governing body composed entirely of administration loyalists. Names reportedly floated included Steve Bannon and Kash Patel, figures who would have decisive authority over what forms of art were deemed appropriate or patriotic. There were even discussions about renaming the Grand Foyer as the Mega Hall of Liberty, of educational outreach programs, initiatives that bring theater, jazz, and cultural exposure to underserved children, were slated for elimination, replaced with programming aligned with 1776 Commission-style ideological messaging. In plain terms, this was an attempted hostile takeover of American cultural life. A living memorial honoring a president associated with intellect, public service, and diplomacy was being reshaped into an extension of one man's political brand. From ethics to illegality. At this point, the issue moved beyond ethical controversy and entered potential criminal territory, something the Senate Intelligence Committee quickly recognized. After reviewing financial disclosures and proposed contracts, investigators identified a troubling pattern. The so-called revitalization of the Kennedy Center was never intended to be handled by independent, vetted construction firms. Instead, oversight was assigned to a shell company operating within the World Liberty Financial Crypto Project, an entity with direct ties to the Trump family. The plan involved routing approximately $400 million in taxpayer funds, originally allocated for emergency infrastructure, through this company, effectively recycling management fees back into the president's own financial orbit. This financial structure explains the magnitude of today's court ruling. The judge determined that preliminary transfers had already begun before Congress granted authorization, a clear violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. The ruling emphasized that such actions undermine the separation of powers and fundamentally breach the public trust. The court's language was unequivocal. The executive branch is not permitted to treat the federal treasury as a personal funding source for vanity-driven projects. The $75 million penalty is not merely punitive, it is restitution. It represents the judiciary's demand that improperly diverted funds be returned. Why the Senate broke ranks. For much of the past year, Republican senators have gone to extraordinary lengths to defend conduct that would once have been indefensible, justifying the dismissal of an FBI director, overlooking controversial surveillance practices, and remaining silent amid humanitarian crises abroad. So what changed? The answer has nothing to do with a sudden appreciation for the arts. The shift came from political vulnerability. Last month, major donors quietly withdrew hundreds of millions of dollars from the president's political committees. That withdrawal sent a clear signal to party leadership. The operation was no longer stable. With the 2026 midterms approaching, senators are reassessing the landscape. What they see is a president under investigation, politically exposed, and hemorrhaging support. No longer an asset, now a liability. Today's vote was a warning shot. It was the Senate saying, plainly, government machinery will not be used for personal enrichment. This marks one of the clearest signs yet that the president's grip on his own party is weakening, and that Congress is beginning to reclaim its constitutional authority over federal spending. The danger ahead. Still, it would be reckless to assume the threat has passed. A president who feels cornered, publicly rebuked, and hit with massive financial penalties is not a diminished risk. Donald Trump has never accepted defeat quietly. He does not interpret congressional resistance as lawful oversight. He interprets it as betrayal. The next 48 hours matter. With the Kennedy Center off the table and fines looming, liquidity pressures are intensifying. When traditional funding avenues close and donor networks dry up, attention shifts to less regulated alternatives. That brings renewed focus to the administration's crypto-related executive actions. As conventional routes narrow, expect sharper moves toward digital assets, potentially aimed at inflating the value of holdings linked to the president and his inner circle. Desperation does not retreat, it adapts. We may also see emergency exceptions granted to questionable foreign actors, oligarchs from Russia, the Gulf, or elsewhere, channeling money into private ventures under the guise of legitimate investment. Today's ruling is a win for the rule of law, but it also raises the stakes. Why culture was the target. The Kennedy Center was not chosen at random. The president understands a fundamental truth. Culture shapes politics. Control the stories a nation tells about itself, and you shape how that nation understands power, identity, and belonging. This was an attempt to overwrite a legacy rooted in civil rights, diplomacy, and public service, with one driven by grievance, isolationism, and authoritarian impulse. While the Senate blocked the physical takeover, the broader struggle for cultural influence continues. In schools where books are banned, in universities facing funding threats, and in public institutions pressured to conform. The Kennedy Center fight was a flashpoint, not an endpoint. A message to the public. To those who have felt powerless over the past year, this moment matters. A president attempted to reshape one of America's cultural crown jewels and was stopped. A renaming effort widely regarded as unauthorized was challenged by lawmakers, legal experts, and the Kennedy family itself. Under federal law, the institution still bears its original name, and Congress has reaffirmed that status. The lesson is not comfort, it is possibility. Resistance works when it is informed, sustained, and collective. But vigilance must continue. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires attention to the money, the contracts, the executive orders, and the quiet maneuvers that rarely make headlines. Let this be clear to those in power. We are watching, we are tracking, and we will not allow the nation's cultural, civic, or constitutional treasures to be dismantled for private gain. The Kennedy Center still stands, its mission intact. And that should remind us of something essential. If one institution can be defended, so can the republic itself. Stay engaged, stay informed, share facts, speak up.